afternoon, everybody. I hope you're feeling nice and relaxed after that music. It just gives you a chance to kind of sit down at the session and breathe before we get started. So good afternoon. I'd love to welcome you on behalf of Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums to Created. This is our subject specialist training series for teachers. So you're very welcome to be here. Our session today is focusing on dinosaurs, evolution and the living planet. I'm Charlotte and I'm CPD manager here in our cultural learning team. Our mission at Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums is to welcome and connect people to the past, present and future of the Northeast through stories, shared spaces like today and experiences. And in our regional cultural learning team, we connect the cultural and education sectors together through events like this so that children and young people have access to a really rich pot of cultural capital. So now I would like to hand over to our facilitators for this afternoon. And today is going to be supported by myself and Mel. You can see her up on the screen. Mel is our programme manager for the regional cultural learning team here at TWAM. We also have Danny Patrick here as our digital stage manager. Hi, Danny. For the session. So if you've got any tech issues during the session, just drop Danny a line in the chat. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce our facilitators for this afternoon. We've got three great people for you. First up, we're going to have Dr. Kate Holden, who is Learning Officer at Great North Museum, Hancock, and she's going to let you all know what schools can do at the museum around this particular subject. Then I'm going to stomp back to dinosaur times with Andrew Fox, our created producer and curriculum expert. And we're going to look at the primary science curriculum through dinosaurs, Northumberland, living planet, and looking at classifications, habitats and evolution. And then after the break, we're going to explore further into the world of species and evolution. And we're going to be joined by our special guest, marine biologist and scientist, Dr. Russell Arnott. Hi, Russell, I can see you. He's from Incredible Oceans. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Kate now, and she can tell you all about the Great North Museum, Hancock. Kate.
Hi, I'm not actually sat in the museum at the moment, but you can see a picture of it behind me. And as you can see from that, natural history is our starting point, literally, as you come through the door. So we offer schools programs supporting learning around animals, habitats, classification, and we can offer those things at Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2, all kind of appropriate to the curriculum points along the way, and building on that way in which the primary science curriculum has that kind of cycle of learning about different topics. Thinking about dinosaurs, I have got the animals behind me today. I sometimes appear with our large T-Rex behind me at these things, but we do offer sessions around, workshop sessions around dinosaurs and fossils for early years, for Key Stage 1 and for Key Stage 2. And we have lots of gallery activities that you can use around those things as well. So lots of downloadable resources on the website, but also our Gallery Explorer kits. So we have fossils and dinosaur ones of those. We have habitat bags. We have things around skeletons. We also offer skeletons workshops. And we have things around food chains and food webs. Evolution obviously only comes into the primary curriculum at year 6 in kind of a sort of large scale way, though a lot of the work up until that point is scaffolding where you get to at that point. And we have workshops available for year 6s on evolution and also some gallery support material for that as well. So loads and loads of different options in this kind of topic area. If you're interested in finding out more about it, go to our website. So that's greatnorthmuseum.org.uk, and you'll see at the top of that website a link you can click through to learn. And within that, our schools programme, you can see everything we've got to offer on this for primary schools, both in terms of the workshops available and in terms of the gallery support materials for when you make a visit. And you'll be able to make visit inquiries by clicking through from there. So I'm going to stop there because, as I say, I've given you an overview. go to the website for a little bit more detail. If you've got any questions, then by all means, drop me an email or go in through the website, and hopefully we'll see some of you in the museum at some point soon. I'm going to pass you over to Andrew.
Thank you, Kate. Hello everyone, my name's Andrew Fox. I'm leading today's Created session, which is the fourth, I believe now, and what a journey it's been. And the events are all inspired, obviously, by the Tyne and Wear Archive and Museum collections across the different TWAM sites. And I've put the sessions together to basically support you with working with the collections, just as Kate was describing, in a kind of like a knowledge map format, so that you can see where all the different areas are that you can connect into, and know where everything is in that very rich curriculum that Kate was just describing. So a bit of housekeeping from me. There's audio-visual content in my sessions, not quite so much in this one as the other ones, but there still is some. So there's sound, and there's also lots to see and hear. So if you've got a pair of headphones, I would pop them in. And if you're in a corridor or a classroom, pop the door closed so that you can concentrate on the happenings. These events are going to be going online. They may be edited slightly before they go online, but you'll all be receiving a PDF version of my presentation as well, so don't worry too much about taking down notes. You can flick through the pages afterwards. Okay, so we're going to start with just a brief overview, a very brief overview of the science curriculum that Kate was just describing. And I was just discussing with Russell before we came on how much that is. And I wanted to cover enough in this event so that you're able to see the many different areas where the science curriculum can connect into what's on show at the Great North Museum, Hancock, and in their collections. So today's session literally follows specifically the Rocks, Fossils and Dinosaurs section, the Natural Northumbria section, and the Living Planet exhibition that was just behind Kate when she was talking. So I've chosen to look at the evolution of the dinosaurs, and Russell's going to pick up on where I leave off and go into much more detail about that whole era and discuss evolution and adaptation and interdependence with you. But for habitats and animals, we're going to look at Natural Northumbria and the Living Planet. So I think I'm going to be around about just over an hour. Then we'll take a 10 or 15 minute break, after which I will hand over to Russell to continue. So you probably saw in the adverts and stuff what we're aiming to achieve. We covered, we did the last event was science, so we covered space, light and sound. So there's a whole load of stuff to get hold of in the science curriculum that you can learn about and learn through at the TWAM sites. But I've just specifically popped these in. I'm not going to talk through all these, but these are just all the different areas that Kate was talking about of that very rich Science Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 primary curriculum. And of course, the name of the game is that all of this needs to be sequential. It needs to build. But the things I've put in here are all things that I've seen that you can connect into and learn with and through at the TWAM sites, and indeed the sites that we're going to discuss that are in the exhibitions but are located in Northumbria and around the world. Okay, let's make a start. Okay, for the first section this afternoon, I wanted to take a look at the age of the dinosaurs, but that's a big subject. So we're going to take a broader view and in a way that mirrors the collections and exhibits at GNMH, I'm going to call it, to save saying Great North Museum, Hancock every time. Obviously, we can't go into such a vast subject in detail within such a short amount of time, but we can look at an overview to help frame the curriculum and to also help us gain a better understanding and knowledge base before perhaps we wanted to zoom into the particular areas of that era. So let's step back, as we've done on the other events, to set the context for the dinosaurs against the bigger picture. So Earth began around 4 billion years ago in what's known as the Hadean period, and it was during this time that our moon was formed and we were bombarded with meteorites, and our atmosphere came into being that allows us to live. And then the first signs of life emerged during the Archean period around 2 to 3 billion years ago, where volcanic activity was rife. Continental land masses appear and the first bacteria begin the tree of life. And for those of you that were on the space event with us last week, this is exactly why it is possible that life could be found on other planets. So a nice connection there. So the first animals began to appear in the Proterozoic period, and by the time we reached the Cambrian period around 500 million years ago, evolution truly explodes with fish, mollusks, trilobites, and rising sea levels and rising global temperatures. In the Silurian period, we see the first bony fish and sharks, and it's around this time that the first creatures were crawling onto the beaches and taking breaths of air in our new atmosphere. And in the Devonian period, we see rapid development of the fish and forests, but this period ended with a mass extinction event which decimated many of the world's ocean ecosystems. But it's when we get to the Carboniferous period that things start to kind of like hot up when it comes to the dinosaurs, and all of that story begins around about 300 million years ago. So we're going to take a closer look at these periods in which the dinosaur evolved, and as I mentioned, you can follow and track these at the exhibition through the fossils and the exhibits. So we're going to look at the key development points of the Carboniferous, the Permian, and the collective three periods that are known as the Mesozoic period. So one species that began to sadly gradually die out, it'd be great if they're still around, due to the mass extinction event in the Devonian period, was the trilobites. But the terrestrial ecosystems were booming, and marine life such as arthropods, mollusks, nautiloids and sharks started to recover in the warm seas. And the Carboniferous period is defined by its extremes, and it saw the highest oxygen levels ever known, and with that brought super huge bugs, which must have been pretty scary, very large insects and arachnids, and there was climate change on an unprecedented level. And in the super oxygenated boom, the first amphibians began to evolve from fish, insects formed from arthropods, and the first primitive trees were formed in a world that was starting to resemble something like it is today. The early Carboniferous period also saw the development of reptile-like amphibians, who would be the distant ancestors of mammals and birds and the reptiles we know now. But they would follow many millions of years later. And the temperatures and sea levels plummeted during the second half of the Carboniferous period. And for the first time in Earth's history, carbon dioxide levels fell to roughly what they were before the Industrial Revolution. And this brought about a collapse in the rainforests at the end of the period. And of course, the coal beds that provide our fossil fuels today were formed during this time, and because coal takes millions of years to develop and there is a limited amount of it, it is a non-renewable resource, as we know. But the conditions that would eventually create coal began to develop around 300 million years ago during the Carboniferous period. And in that period, it was famous for its vast swamp forests, and in this nutrient and oxygen-rich zone, many different amphibians and reptiles developed. Pholidurpiton, which is Greek for creeping thing, was an amphibian which lived in the late Carboniferous period, along with the Xenacanthus and the Gyrocanthus, who were like shark-like fish that lived in freshwater and shallow marine habitats, and they look like they'd give you a nasty nip on your toesies. The swamps and the forests were also home to rich vegetarian and tree growth, such as the now extinct Sigillaria and the Caudates trees, and they're thought to represent our earliest conifers, and they grew to a whopping 100 feet tall, and they could live in both the dry and the wet land areas of the Carboniferous era. So the period began with the extinction of all armoured fish and many sea scorpions, but it gave rise to a new wave of strange predators. And this period lasted from 359 to 299 million years ago. And it's sometimes referred to as the golden age of sharks. It was a time of diverse marine life, and many fish inhabited the seas, predominantly the ones that were related to sharks, like Tristichius, looked like a modern dogfish, and Adestus. That was like a large shark-like fish that had tooth walls that were positioned in the centre of its mouth. Quite a strange-looking thing, which gave it its nickname, the scissor-tooth shark. And scientists believe that he used this strange jaw, like scissors, to cut through smaller fish and soft-bodied creatures. And there were also terrifying things like the Tully monstrum, or the Tully monster, that lived around 307 million years ago in the shallow tropical waters off the coasts and estuaries. And the Diplocaulus was a fairly large amphibian, and that lived in what is now North America and Africa, and it grew up to about 1 metre in length, and it had a body similar to a salamander, and it probably snacked on insects and small fish. And in the Carboniferous oceans, there were also many different marine invertebrate groups. There's corals, bryozoa, brachiopods like the Spirifa, and mollusks and sea snails. So everything was kind of swishing around and bubbling with life. And as the volatile Carboniferous period ended, the climate stabilised, glaciers receded, and oxygen levels dropped, and then we move into the Permian period. And in this era, the world, not that we know properly, but was thought to be rather like what we know today, with distinct climate belts forming a diverse range of ecosystems around the planet, and with very few large herbivore animals to feed upon them. Plants just went crazy, and just about every corner of the globe was covered in green, which was a new ecosystem for the animal life to exploit. Land animals grew larger and more diverse than ever before, and that heralded in the age of the amphibians, who would evolve and diversify, with some species starting to slightly resemble today's mammals, although it would still be tens of millions of years before the true mammals would appear. And during this time, synapsids, which are a group of animals that included all mammals, underwent a big diversification, giving rise to the extremely successful and diverse group of animals, the Dimetrodon, and they were like Komodo dragons. You've probably seen pictures of them, and they've got those distinctive sails on their back, like huge lizards, and they weren't actually dinosaurs. At the end of the Permian era, a severe extinction event happened. Marine ecosystems were left devastated, with as many as 96% of all species completely disappearing off the face of the Earth forever. And terrestrial ecosystems also underwent a devastating series of mass extinctions, with over 2/3 of all land vertebrates copying it, and even the insects took a major hit during this event, and it was their only mass dying event of their kind. So following the devastating mass extinction at the end of the Permian era, life started to gradually rebound back in the Triassic period, and it's in the Triassic era that marks so the Triassic era runs into the Jurassic, and that's the start of the Mesozoic period. And it would take tens of millions of years for life to recover, but eventually the world's impoverished biosphere would give rise and bring forward the first dinosaurs that roamed the earth. So it's quite an important time. And at the start of the Triassic period, life in the oceans was recovering and new marine ecosystems were being formed. And eventually the oceans were hospitable enough to welcome the return of some of the marine reptiles who survived right up until the extinction of dinosaurs, actually. And this included the plesiosaurs. And it was during this time that the small Eoraptor evolved, and the Eoraptor was one of the earliest true dinosaurs, and the first mammals appeared during this era as well, and they were emerged as pretty much small mouse-like creatures like shrews. So following the evolution of the first dinosaurs, the Jurassic period starts about 201.3 million years ago, and this was when the reign of the dinosaurs would really reach its golden age, and the largest and most magnificent animals that the world's pretty much ever seen would roam the earth. And during the Jurassic era, the large supercontinent on which everything lived, called the Pangaea, first began to tear apart, and cracks grew between Africa, South America and North America. So a heck of a lot of important stuff going on in the Triassic into the Jurassic period. And of course there were many species of dinosaurs that developed, far too many to cover in one event. That developed right across the Mesozoic period, including the popular T-Rex, which they now believe had feathers, which is interesting. But some more familiar animals and plants emerged also. There were snakes, and some of these were pretty horrific, and they reached a terrifying 24 foot in length. Just the thought of that, I really hate snakes. It was also an important time period in the early evolution of the major plants that dominate our kind of modern world, and the origins of living conifers that we know now, such as cypresses, pines and ginkgo trees. They can all be traced back to at least the beginning of the Jurassic era. And as I mentioned before, marine life during the Mesozoic boomed, with many amphibians, reptiles and fish developing. The plesiosaurs ruled the oceans along with the ichthyosaurs. And ichthyosaur, meaning fish lizard, they dominated the world's oceans for millions of years and arrived actually 20 million years before the dinos did. And the early ichthyosaurs looked pretty much like lizards with fins, but over the 100 million years of their existence, they evolved into more fish-like creatures, and that secured them a place at the top of the ancient food chain. So that's a long period of time for a creature to evolve. Many of what we call living fossils came from the Mesozoic era as well. So the phrase living fossil refers to an archaic species that has survived for a long time, and whose anatomy harks back to an earlier stage in the evolutionary tree, and that hasn't changed much basically. And the horseshoe crab is a good example of that, of a living fossil. And they are marine arthropods that go back millions of years, but actually, despite their name, they are not true crabs, and they are more closely related to arachnids like spiders and ticks and scorpions. Yeah. Pterosaurs dominated the skies during most of the Mesozoic, and they are the earliest vertebrates known to have evolved power flight. and contrary to popular belief, creatures like the pterodactyl were not actually dinosaurs. The dinosaurs that flew were Archaeopteryx, and it's these flying dinosaurs that eventually evolved into the birds that we know today. So there's a distinct difference between the pterosaurs and the flying dinosaurs. And Archaeopteryx, which lived around 150 million years ago during the late Jurassic, is widely regarded as the missing link between non-avian dinosaurs and modern birds. And the discovery of Archaeopteryx provides scientists with definite evidence that birds are nothing more than modern dinosaurs, which is quite nice. So as the Jurassic turned into the Cretaceous period, the dinosaurs were at the top of their reign and size, and the largest dinosaurs evolved during the Jurassic era, and they may have weighed up to 100 tons, very, very heavy. And the enormous beasts that were the biggest were the sauropods, and they're among the mightiest and most incredible of all the animals that lived. And obviously the Diplodocus are the most famous of them, and by far the largest of the Jurassic sauropods. But although they are almost 3 times longer than a bus, they weren't actually apparently that heavy for their size, due to them having an extremely long and slender neck and tail. So the Cretaceous represents the rise and fall of the dinosaurs and the final period of the 186 million year long Mesozoic era. And the period ended with one of the most devastating extinction events of all time. And by the beginning of the Cretaceous period, the dinosaurs had already been dominating terrestrial ecosystems for some 86 million years. And their reign would continue for another 79 million, which is more time than has elapsed between their ultimate extinction and the modern day. But sadly, 66 million years ago, the Dino Party came to an end. And the extinction event, which is now widely believed to have been caused by an asteroid or a comet impacting Earth, sealed the fate of almost every animal on Earth that was larger than a sheep. Okay, so Russell's going to pick up on the dinosaur era in much more detail, and now we're going to gently move forwards to modern day and very close to home in Northumbria. Northumbria was an early medieval Anglo-Saxon kingdom in what is now northern England, as we know, and the name goes back to Old English from a saying that meant the people or province north of the Humber, as opposed to the people the south of the Humber estuary. But in modern context, Northumbria refers to the region of England between the Tees, the River Tees and the Tweed, and it includes Northumberland and Durham, but it may also be taken to just mean northeast England, which is fine. So Natural Northumbria, as I mentioned, is one of the collections at GNMH, and it looks at different animal habitats in the region in different areas of urban, of lowlands, of uplands, seas and coasts, and woodlands. So we're going to, in this next part, follow that exhibition through each of those areas and take a look at some of the specific areas and just see what kind of animals, birds and habitats thrive in each of those. And I think it's really important to point out at this point, and I kind of alluded to it at the start, but perhaps didn't make myself clear, that as well as the collections, these places themselves, I see them as living classrooms. You know, it goes without saying that if you can take your classes out to these places, then even better. So we'll start by looking at urban habitat that's close to home and the city. And of course, the city of Newcastle, or any city itself, is a place, you know, that wildlife will live. But just on the outskirts is Gosforth Park. As you may already know, Gosforth Park is a nature reserve just a few miles out of Newcastle, and it's home to many species, including heron, kingfisher, roe deer, and many small animals. So there's a lot of rich wildlife in Gosforth. There's flourishing wildlife all around the lake, and on its fringes there's nationally important wet woodland in the park that supports older trees and birch and willow trees. The camouflage of the surrounding reed beds on the lake, they shelter moorhens and reed bunting, and the lake itself attracts many different migrant birds, including the common tern. And it's teeming with life, and you can find beetles searching for food beneath the surface of the water, and dragonfly larvae on the reed stems, and that finally emerge as flying adults. You can also spot the water measurer bug, who uses water repelling hairs on its legs to skate across the surface. Kind of cool, that. And newts and frogs breed on the lake margins and hibernate in the leaf litter and the muddy banks. So the lake is home to many different birds, such as coots, grebes and moorhens, who attach their floating nests to the stems of weeds and bulrushes. The reed beds around the lake are vital for these birds because they protect and camouflage their nesting sites, and they attract many insects, providing food for the warblers and buntings. And the lake also provides food for the splendid grey heron, which nest together there in a hennery. Okay, moving away from the urban areas now into the lowlands, there's three specific areas that the collection covers. There's Waldrich Fell, Tunstall Hills, and Cockle Hill Farm. And we're going to take a look at Cockle Hill Farm. So Cockle Park Farm is a working farm owned by Newcastle University, and it's located to the north of Morpeth in Northumberland. So the farm links farming practice, landscape management and rural enterprise all kind of together, and believe it or not, farming and wildlife do and can successfully coexist in these sort of places. Like many lowland Northumbrian farms, it produces livestock and arable crops, but staff at the farm also test and monitor sustainable farming practices, and they work with experts to create habitats for wildlife. And these habitats support over 600 plants, about 1,500 insects, 65 birds, and 20 mammal species. So a lot of important work going on there. Wildlife takes advantage of free food at Cockle Park, and starlings and other birds will pick up like the leftover grain and feed, and insects are stirred up by the grazing animals and cowpats. There's ideal environments for beetles and flies that feed on the dung. And the beetles are this is all an important process because the nutrients are recycled in areas like this, and then they're released from the cowpats back into the land by the creatures. So it's an important part, beetles and cowpats. In spring, the field margins and hedges provide ideal nesting sites for a lot of birds, including yellowhammer. And insects sharing this habitat are an essential source of food for their newly hatched chicks. And by autumn, the hawthorn hedges also supply lots of nutritious berries for the birds and small animals, such as the harvest mouse, who breed there in the summer. So moving to the uplands now, which can be quite an unforgiving, wild, wet and windy environment. So it's a very different place for birds and creatures to live. And only the hardiest residents survive, and the high altitude means that the trees are scarce, but these upland landscapes do support a diverse range of plants, animals and invertebrates. So the first of our 4 upland areas we will look at is the Cheviot Hills.
So the Cheviots, as they're known, are a range of upland straddling Anglo-Scottish border between Northumberland and the Scottish borders, in which English section is actually within the Northumberland National Park. 380 million years ago, so we're going back to those times, the Cheviot Hills had a fiery burst during the Devonian period before it was Carboniferous. When the land that will become the British Isles was part of 2 land masses separated by an ancient ocean. When this ocean closed, the 2 land masses collided and it caused mountain building and volcanic eruptions. And this violent activity then created Cheviot Hills, which are formed from granite, lava, and earth. And these rocks came from a large volcano which was active at this time. And about 20 million years after the volcano became extinct, a lump of hot magma was forced up to its centre, and this gradually appeared to form granite, and it's this granite body that forms the Cheviot itself. So as you walk over the hills, you can find really beautiful semi-precious stones, nice hunting game there, which were filmed during these times, and they're distinctive because they've got these red and pink colourings. And life in the remote habitat of the Cheviot Hills can be hard, but plants are found there, and there are some pretty hardy animals such as the Cheviot goats that are quite happy surviving in that environment. But in summer, birds such as windchat and skylark visit, and the ringed weasel breed on the Cheviots as well, because there's plenty of insects for the young chicks. A very different environment to the lowland and suburban. Then the next one we have is Alston Moor. So if you are unaware where Alston Moor is a civil parish and an electoral ward in the
Westmoreland and Furness district in the county of Cumbria, and it's set in the moorlands of the North Pennines at an altitude of 1,000 feet. So it's one of the highest settlements in England, and the moor itself is an important habitat for many animals. There's old mine workings that scarred Alston Moor, and the process of extracting ore disturbed the soil chemistry. So now only plants that can tolerate the conditions can thrive in these disturbed areas, such as alpine pennycress and spring sandwort. And that's because they can tolerate and even absorb the amount of zinc and lead that's in the soil there, that's been left from all that old mining activity. The heathers and grasses that cover Alston Moor support many small birds and animals, such as field voles, and these are important food sources for birds of prey. So there's owls and peregrine falcons spotted on Alston Moor, beautiful birds. And they visit the moor during the summer to feed and breed, and Alston Moor is also home to an important population of endangered black grouse, but also the red grouse as well live there. And they manage the moorland, which I found quite interesting, by burning the heather, because this prevents the plants from becoming too woody. And then in the new growth comes the succulent green shoots, which are the main source of food for the grouse. So that's quite an important, sort of almost man-made intervention there that's supporting the grouse. Then there's Butterburn Flow, which is a wild and remote area of blanket bog on the Northumberland-Cumbria border. The bog lies over the landscape pretty much like a wet blanket, and it receives moisture from groundwater as well as from rainfall, and it's what's known as a blanket bog. and only plants tolerant to such conditions, such as moss, can grow there. And bogs like this apparently are under threat from dying out because the trees take up the water and drainage ditches that dry out the bog, and there's a lot of work going into keeping these places alive by people like the Forestry Commission and the Northumberland Wildlife Trust, because it's a very important habitat and wetland. So Butterburn Flow is the largest of the border meres, and it began to form at the end of the last ice age. So the hollows scoured out by the ice sheets and glaciers and the cool wet climate produced an ideal habitat for bog plants. And the soils are low in nutrients, and some plants have a bolder and unique way of surviving because of that, such as the greatest sundew and the butterwort. And they trap insects by releasing a sticky fluid from the surface of their leaves, so tiny little triffids. And it's also home to more beautiful birds, endangered species, including the golden eagle and the peregrine falcon. So Upper Teesdale Nature Reserve is a national nature reserve that covers a lot of area on the Pennine Moors in the north of England, and that straddles between Cumbria and County Durham, and it's been designated a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in 1976. And the habitats of Upper Teesdale Nature Reserve are carefully managed to enable survival of the rare plants that grow there, and these in turn provide a source of food and shelter for different butterflies and moths. In Upper Teesdale region during the Carboniferous era, so we're going back there again, hot molten rock was forced up through the existing rocks, and when it cooled, it became the rock formation that forms part of the Upper Teesdale Dale, and the heat from the magma baked the Carboniferous limestone, turning it into marble. And the marble weathers, and it looks like crumbly sugar, hence its name, and it forms a shallow sandy soil called sugar limestone. And sugar limestone supports a very special community of rare plants like spring gentian and Teesdale violets, and many of these plants are cold climate species which appeared in Britain after the last ice age and are specially adapted to the cool wet climate of Upper Teesdale. So moving out to the Season Coasts, and we often visit the Season Coast for scenery and for recreation, but birds and marine creatures depend on this habitat. The spectacular cliffs and bays and sandy beaches provide shelter and food for migrating birds that feed on the small animals there. And the coastal habitats with cliffs, beaches and mudflats and dunes are important for many, lots and lots of different species, which then attract predators like foxes, stoats and rats. And the coasts are obviously also home to an array of marine animals such as dolphins and seals and even otters. So Druridge Bay, that's a 7-mile long bay on the North Sea in Northumberland, stretching from Amble in the north to Creswell in the south. And Druridge Bay Country Park is situated on the bay, and part of the bay is owned by the National Trust, so there's a lot of care being taken of that area. Coastal areas on the bay are set aside as nature reserves and include mature sand dunes, dune grassland and freshwater pools and lagoons. And the dunes are home to specialist plants or specialised plants that are able to cope with the dry, salty and windy conditions. Bloody cranesbill and burnet rose are among the plants which colonise the main body of the dunes, and limegrass also dominate the wind-blown edges. And the long roots of these grasses bind the dunes together and provide staple slopes on which more delicate plants can grow. The freshwater pools and lagoons, they support wetland plants such as marsh arrowgrass, and they are vital to providing food and shelter for the migrating birds such as the curlew and their little stint. And the bay is also home to Garganey ducks, otters, as we just mentioned, great crested newts, and various wading birds who visit the exposed beach at low tide for food. And then we go to Seal Sands, which is a biological site of special scientific interest in County Durham and situated in the mouth of the River Tees. And Seal Sands is the main breeding colony of common seals in the northeast coast, and it's an internationally recognised site for migrating grey and common seals have been seen there. And common seals are also known as harbour seals, and they rest on the sandbanks during low tides. And they dive for fish such as flounder and plaice, which they catch in the area, and also for mollusks and crustaceans. And each summer, a female seal will give birth to one baby pup, and then these can crawl and swim within a few hours, and then live for as long as 30 years. Red shank birds rest here on their journey to and from Arctic breeding grounds, and Seal Sands is an important habitat for wading birds. Some just stay for the winter, others live there all year round. So the curlew, which is Europe's largest wader, visits in the winter, and numbers of knot birds can exceed 10,000, which is a big flock. And these visitors basically, they feed on the nutritious invertebrates in the area living in the mud, and this food ensures that the birds survive the winter, and then they're ready to leave again in the summer. So St Mary's Island is a small sandstone island near the seaside resort of Whitley Bay, and it's a local nature reserve and has a shoreline with many rock pools, with all the usual suspects that you'll find in a rock pool, so crabs, shrimps and limpets, and all of these obviously have to adapt to the changing tidal, the changing tides in the area. And many plants and animals thrive on the rocky shore at St Mary's Island, such as sea slugs and sea lemon and sea hare. So the sea lemon's colour comes from the sponges that they eat, and the sea hare, which releases ink when they get disturbed, acts like a smoke screen, and depending on what they've been having for their supper depends on the colour of the ink that they release. So the coast around St Mary's Island has one of the best natural exposures of Carboniferous coal measure rocks found in Britain. So we're back to that era again. The sandstone contains layers of coal called seams and mudstones, and this is one of the few places in the country where coal is actually exposed at the coast. So small pieces of this coal known as sea coal, they kind of weather out of the cliffs, and then you can find it washed up on the beach in that area. And I'm not sure if you knew, but I like my history. In 1891, a Canadian ship called the Gothenburg City was shipwrecked on its way to South Shields, and on the cargo of the Gothenburg City was minerals which spilled into the sea, and as a result green pebbles are now washing up on the shore, which is would be a rather magical thing to find when you were young. And then we got the Farne Islands and the holy island of Lindisfarne. The Vikings are long gone, and these lie off the coast of Northumberland in the northeast. So the distinct island groups form the outer and inner, so two distinct island groups form the outer and inner farms, and they are a celebrated seabird sanctuary with around 20 species, all kind of on the rocks, so it's quite a crowded area of birds. And And each summer the Farne Islands support thousands of nesting seabirds, including terns and guillemots, and it's also one of the best places in Britain to see a breeding colony of puffins. And they nest in burrows where predators can't easily reach them. And like many of the birds on the Farne Islands, puffins feed on the sand eels that they get there. So other birds that are spotted are whooper swans, characterised by the whoop whoop, the widgeon, and even the eider duck is found in the area. Okay, so finally, from natural Northumberland, we'll look at some of the woodland areas of the northeast, because obviously woodland supports a remarkable variety of wildlife. Thornley Woods is a woodland in Gateshead's Derwent Valley, and it's a rich woods full of broadleaf trees, so lots of English oaks, areas of downy birch, and it's a perfect place to observe the changing of the seasons. So as with all woods, when spring comes, you know, the bright green buds appear to make the most of the available light. Before the leaves of the trees are then fully formed and animals come out of hibernation, and the treetops start to ring with songbirds, including chiffchaffs and willow warblers, who will make welcome meals from the plentiful insects on the woodland floor. So by summer, the woods and the hedgerows will develop rich berries and seeds, and the breeding birds take advantage of this dense leaf cover to hide from any predators. And then in autumn, mushroom and toadstools appear under the leaf canopy. And then you get into winter, where the deciduous trees have lost all their leaves and the woodland becomes relatively quiet, with very few insects to be found. And all the hedgehogs and small mammals and creatures are fast asleep hibernating. So Keidler Forest is a large forestry plantation in Northumberland, surrounding the Keidler Water Reservoir. It is the largest man-made woodland in England, with 3/4 of its 250 square miles covered by forest. It's got around about 150 million trees, including conifers like Norway spruce, that generate a valuable source of timber. But sensitive conservation management is ensuring that the forest also provides for its natural residents as well, and that includes bats and long-eared owls. And it's home to around about 6,000 roe deer in the forest, and pine martens are also sighted there. And apparently there's a big midgie problem, as there always is in these places with lakes and greenery. So crossbills are one of the few birds at Keidler, and they are specifically adapted to feed on the conifer seeds by using their cross beaks to extract seeds from behind the scales of the clones. It's also home to other specialist birds, including goshawks, that feed on rodents. They were a reintroduced bird of prey. And also Britain's smallest songbird, the goldcrest, is also found there. And the forest also supports a large proportion of England's red squirrel population because of the condition. So red squirrels have suffered because the grey squirrels, which were introduced from America, spread the lethal squirrel pox virus to the reds. But this forest is an ideal stronghold for the reds because they feed on the seeds of the conifer cones, and it's not an ideal environment for the greys, so the red squirrels are thriving here. Castle Edendene is apparently the largest area of ancient woodland in the northeast, another site of special scientific interest, and it is home to a big variety of birds, around about 450 species of plants and some of our best loved and favourite mammals. And the Dean provides a rich source of food for predatory animals, including foxes and stoats. And one of the most successful predators there is the beautiful tawny owl, who is a silent hunter with exceptional eyesight. And she glides through the canopy with sharp eyes, spotting the prey amongst the leaf litter on the floor, and picks up things like mice. So Castle Edendene is an important site for invertebrates. The Blomer's rivulet moth, the North Argus butterfly and the sallow kitten moth are all spotted there. And the rotting vegetation provides food and shelter, and the softened wood is decomposed by the beetle grubs and wood lice and snails, which, as we was describing before, then releases the nutrients, which is welcomed food for plants. It's an ideal area for fungi as well, and they absorb nutrients from the decaying leaf litter and the dead wood. And fungi produces fruiting bodies, which come in many varieties, none of which you should eat, I must say, from bright red fly agaric to the tiny clusters of the coral spot fungi. So don't chop any of those up and put them in your stir fry. So many diverse different environments local to home that you can use as living classrooms. So now we're going to do the same thing following the Living Planet exhibition and collection of animals, and look through similar goggles at the wider world. And the collection itself at GNMH moves through the different climate zones of Earth, which is desert, tropical, temperate and polar. So we'll have a look at all of those. So the desert regions are among the most inhospitable areas on planet Earth, as you well know, and to live in the desert, animals and plants must be able to cope with those extreme temperatures and limited resources. And owing to the lack of water, some animals get moisture from seeds and plants. And to avoid the fierce heat, many species go hunting for food at night. And some of them spend much of their time underground, obviously to shelter from the intense heat. And with little shelter or water, few large animals thrive. And so many reptiles and rodents make their home in the deserts, such as the desert kangaroo rat and the stump-tailed lizard, both of which are at home in those hot conditions. And in the fierce heat of the desert, food is obviously scarce and water is in short supply. Young animals are often vulnerable in these harsh conditions, so creatures have to adapt and find ways to replenish, refresh and feed their young. And the Pallas sandgrouse finds water holes and then soaks its breast feathers and then carries the water back in the feathers to its thirsty chicks, so an innovative way to provide water. And other birds such as the Andean condor, they will travel at great distances high above the desert searching for food. And as I've just mentioned, life in the desert is predominantly small animals, because without the shelter of water, large animals just don't really want to be there. But lizards such as the black spiny-tailed iguana, they'll hide in rocky crevices to escape the heat of the day, as well as to hide from potential predators. And meerkats seem to do okay in the desert, and they live in large groups, and some members hunt for food while others act as lookouts. And I think we've all seen what you can see there on the screen, a quite comical way that they scan the horizon to spot any approaching predators. And the intense dryness and extreme temperatures of deserts mean that relatively few animals can live in them. And the animals that do live there have a variety of adaptations that help them conserve water and cope with the harsh conditions. So spring hares produce highly concentrated urine and drop-ins and can survive for days without water. And gopher snakes become nocturnal during the hottest part of the day, just to avoid that direct sunlight. And in the deep sea areas of the desert regions, there's a lack of light and oxygen, and the intense pressure down in that depth makes survival very challenging. And in the hostile environment, there's many strange looking and highly specialised species that have evolved. In the deep oceans, it's pitch black and very cold, and more people have walked on the moon than have been to the deepest parts of the sea, which makes it one of the least known habitats on Earth. Many deep sea animals look really bizarre down there. The oversized spider crab, and there's a beautiful big model of one of those at the museum, and the anglerfish and the lanternfish have got huge jaws. And then there's other mammals like the hagfish, who are scavengers, and they basically swim around at the bottom and wait for dead stuff to fall from above. There is kind of vegetation down there. There's the deep sea whip, that's found growing on the rocks at depths down to about 20 metres or 66 foot, and that's found along the western fringes of the Atlantic Ocean. And life in the deep is impossible. In the deep oceans is impossible for humans, and up until 1948 scientists thought it was too extreme for any life, but they now know that the deep oceans are home to an extraordinary diverse kind of biodiversity, including fishes, jellyfish, sea cucumbers and bacteria, and even some octopuses get down that deep as well. And they've all got unique adaptations that allow them to survive down there. And one group of animals thriving in the deeps are the amphipods, and this one here is called Eurythene plasticus, and they have adapted the ability to eat almost any food, so scavengers that sink down into the trench at the bottom of the sea. But unfortunately, as non-picky eaters, they can eat non-food items like plastic, which is where he got his name from. And there's a whole section in the museum where you can learn all about how that all came about and the science behind it. So in the tropical zones, animals and plants are well adapted to cope with the hot and humid conditions. Food and water is plentiful and supports many specialist feeders, some of them being dependent on almost entirely on one specific food source. Preying animals have developed a range of defensive techniques to avoid being eaten, and some animals use mimicry, so copying, or camouflage, and some of them have even got poisonous skins. But the predators have also got tricks of their own, including speed and ambush, to name a few. And there is a lot of different methods to deter predators in the tropical region. Many animals, like the squirrel monkeys, live in large groups for protection, and some species, like the armadillo, have got a defensive body and armour or weapons, which can give any predators a nasty spike and see them off. And animals in the tropics also exhibit some of the most spectacular rituals, as they all compete for a mate. And birds exhibit, really big displays when it comes to competing for mates. And the purple-crested turacos are a good example. They flash their bright red feathers as they pursue females through the forest. And also the boa birds build unique structures called a boa to attract their mates. So the tropical environments, from the dense rainforest to the dry, dusty savannas, present a range of physical challenges to the animals living there, and they adapt. Elephants use their large ears to cool down, and they throw water and dust on themselves to create a protective sunscreen. And gibbons and other rainforest primates use their long arms to swing from tree to tree to move quickly through the canopy. So each animal is adapting in different ways. And the tropical zones contain a range of habitats that support diverse animal communities, and some of these animals depend almost entirely on one food source. So koalas, for example, they feed on eucalyptus leaves, and large predators like tigers feed on grazing herbivores like deer, and toucans handpick fruit from the branches of the forest trees. And one former resident of the tropical region was the dodo, who you may have heard of. And the dodo was a flightless bird native to the tropical island of Mauritius, where it fed on forest plants. And as people settled on Mauritius, they cut down forests and brought rats, cats and pigs and goodness knows what else to the place. And they ended up eating the dodo eggs and chicks. And within 100 years, the dodo became extinct. And for hundreds of years after that, and very few people had heard of the dodo until in 1865, in the children's book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, it was introduced as one of the characters, and it became a household name since then and has been famous ever since. And all the depictions, the ones you can see here of the dodo, they all come from early 20th century depictions, and yeah, the bird looks kind of quite comical, doesn't it? It's sort of portrayed as a fat, fluffy, stupid and dumb thing that was doomed to die. But apparently recent research has shown that these views were wrong, and the dodo was probably as fast and clever as any similar bird until it fell victim to humans. Them humans again. So the tropical oceans surround the Earth in what is known as an equatorial band between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and this belt contains sections of the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, as well as the majority of the Indian Ocean. And the habitats will vary in tropical regions, from steamy mangrove swamps close to land to cool reefs in warm, shallow waters. But tropical oceans contain more species than any other marine habitat, and they're best known for their coral reefs, which we've all probably heard of, which provide a rich ecosystem for the marine life, offering food and shelter among the crevices and branches. And fish hang out there, mollusks, sea urchins and sponges. And although the coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the surface area of the world's oceans, they provide a home for 25% of all marine fish species. And the reefs are dependent on sunlight to allow them for them to grow, and they flourish best in warm, clear water. In the wider tropical oceans, obviously is home to an eclectic variety of different species, such as the green turtle, the flying fish, barracuda, the beautiful manta rays, and seahorses. So moving to the temperate zones, the seasonal climate of the temperate zone heavily influences what can live there, and plants and animals have developed a variety of strategies to cope with changes in temperature and resources. So as the cold weather and the short days of winter approach, some animals will burrow underground, and then others will frantically gather and store food. And during winter, different animals hibernate, and then they'll only emerge again at the first signs of spring when they know the cold weather's gone. And the seasonal climate means that breeding must be carefully timed, and most animals are born during spring and summer when food and shelter is plentiful. And competition in the temperate zones is especially fierce during spring and summer, as the best breeding conditions are quite often only temporary. So there's an enormous pressure to mate while the conditions are right. And males compete for female attention in a variety of ways. So the male kakapos aggressively advertise themselves by calling and dancing, and other animals such as sea lions will compete directly using teeth and claws for an old-fashioned punch-up. And the bodies of animals in the temperate zone are well adapted to cope with seasonal climates. So in the summer, many will hoard food for winter when food is scarce, and then when winter arrives, obviously they'll hibernate, and some rely on fat reserves. The lynx, which has got a thick fur coat for insulation, and different birds migrate to warmer areas, while some that live alone in the summer gather together in groups. And animals living in the temperate zones must be resourceful to cope with changes in temperature that affect the availability of food. And black-winged stilts eat a range of invertebrates which are abundant in the temperate freshwater habitats. But the extensive forests also provide food for many birds and animals, such as the rather charming wildcats, who have got striped fur to help them camouflage while they're stalking small animal and prey. And temperate animals are able to protect themselves in a number of ways. So bison, for example, live in a group called herds, while some animals try to look larger and more intimidating when threatened, like the hoopos, who will raise their large orange-brown crests to try and see people off. Porcupines are covered in large spines called quills, and they raise them, which puts off most predators. It would put me off. And of course there's the tortoises that have their well-known protective shell of bony plates, which shields them well from predators, and they can just hide in. So the temperate oceans extend into two broad belts around the world, in the northern and southern hemispheres. And these cool waters are rich in nutrients, particularly in the coastal areas, and enormous amounts of plankton live in the temperate oceans, and these sustain many invertebrates and huge populations of fish, birds, and animals. And temperate oceans are home to many different types of bony fish, including mackerel, herring, tuna, and different species of cartilaginous fishes, such as sharks and rays. And obviously the great white shark is an inhabitant of the temperate oceans, and the whale shark, so rich mix of life in the temperate oceans. And finally we go to the poles, and needless to say, all life in the polar regions is adapted to resist the cold and to cope with the fluctuating and frequently scarce resources that aren't there. So our polar regions offer an intimate look at unique fauna and life that have adapted to the most extreme climates on Earth, and bitterly cold winds will rip across the landscape, and the temperatures can reach deep into the negatives, and the winter night can literally last for months. So not a very hospitable place. But the barren landscape are home to a rich diversity of wildlife on the land and in the sea. And they've all evolved, like in the other areas, to survive in the conditions that they're in. So fat and fur protects animals from hunger and cold, and some animals migrate during the coldest times and travel long distances to find food. Polar animals use camouflage against the snowy landscape to avoid predators, and then others will protect themselves from attack by living in large groups. And mating is again here is tricky, so finding a mate can prove life-threatening in the poles, as competition is very fierce and fights with rivals and long treks across the icy lands are common for a mate. And competition in the temperate zones is especially fierce during spring and summer, when the best breeding conditions happen, which will be temporary. So there's an enormous amount of pressure to make while the conditions are right. In the poles, birds and mammals protect themselves physically against the cold by growing a winter plumage and a coat of fur, which is usually white to hide from prey when hunting. Oh, that snowy owl looks absolutely gorgeous. And others will have rely on a layer of blubber to prevent heat loss. Some of the creatures also have wide and large paws, which will help them to walk better on ice and snow, and they will all have a good sense of smell. And there are many different predators in polar regions, such as the cute-looking Arctic fox, the wolverine and wolves, and the avian predators, including the snowy owl and the peregrine falcon, and the short-eared owl, all frequent the poles. So finally, the polar oceans are very cold, but they're very rich in nutrients. And in the short polar summer, an explosion of life occurs as blooms of tiny animals and plants. The plankton provide food for vast numbers of invertebrates, fish, birds and mammals. And around Antarctica, a unique marine community has evolved. So you can find slow-growing invertebrates here that can live for many years in the freezing waters. And the cold oceans are also home to starfish and octopus. And there are about 240 fish species in the Arctic Ocean, and one of the most numerous fish species is the Arctic cod, but you can also find other species like the sockeye salmon, very colourful. And of course the polar oceans is where you can experience the majestic beauty of the whales that migrate from afar. And in the polar regions you can see orcas, humpback, sperm, mink and fin whales, and also the strange but beautiful narwhal, which is a species of toothed whale, and it's the adult males that have the long single tusk that can be up to 3 meters in length. Okay, so we've had a good look around the collections for Natural Northumbria, Living Planet, and parts of the Dinosaur and Rocks and Fossils collection. So let's take, what are we doing for time? Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Russell Arnott, who's going to take us back to the Carboniferous era and to the time of the dinosaurs. So if we can all be back for 20 to 3, colleagues. Welcome back, everyone. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Russell Arnott, who's going to continue our session. So the screen's all yours, Russell.
What a rookie error. Ah, you'd think after like 3 years of lockdown Zooming, we'd have cracked this by now. Hi, I'll start again. Hi, my name's Russell. I thought I would make the most of the fact that this is a smaller session and I'd obviously quite like you guys have given up your time to come here and sit in front of a computer. And I'd quite like to make sure I pitch this correctly. So I thought it'd be interesting if people want to just like say who you are and why you're here. So you can either turn on your video and we can't happen. Can people write that in the chat then? Can we happen that in the chat? Can people just kind of type who they are? Can we do that in the chat? Danny, is that doable? I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, Russell, my comment was there. It was just about you being muted, not about anything else.
Oh, okay, no worries. Okay, there we go. That's cool. Yeah, so if people do want to say who they are and why they're here, that'd be really good to make sure that I kind of tailor this appropriately to make sure that people get the most out of it. I'm guessing most people here are teachers. I was a teacher for 8 years. And this is some of the stuff which I found useful applying in the classroom. And I found that the classes, both at primary and secondary level, responded quite well to this kind of content. But do people want to quickly say, just like, hi, I'm Gordon and I like ham? You know, I don't know. That's the first thing that came out of my head. Cool. Nice to meet you, Elizabeth, an artist who works with children and young people across the region. Awesome. Well, hopefully you will get some cool tidbits here to take away and weave into your creative practice. Yeah, we were literally talking before we came on about so one of the things that we do with Incredible Oceans are still life drawing with artifacts. We have an orca skull that we take around, and while people are drawing the orca skull, we do talk about orca anatomy and evolution and things like that. So which is quite cool. Does anyone else want to contribute? That would be great. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Oh, hi, Kat. Years 5 and 6, fantastic. That I've got to say, out of all the ages which I've ever taught, I feel like years 5 and 6 are like my favorite because they're like on it. They're just like really like they're like sponges. They suck everything up, and I like the fact that they challenge you as well, but they're not as annoying as secondary school kids that are all like puberty and all like bleh, and they kind of lose that shine a little bit. But ages 5 and 6 definitely the best. What have we got? Nice to meet you, Sarah, a learning engagement officer, mostly for primary age. Okay, hopefully this will also prove useful. Year 6 and new to the science lead role. Oh, great. That's an exciting job. You're like the in charge of science in the whole school. That's a great way to be, especially in primary school where you've got these like cupboards of equipment and not everyone really knows what that equipment is there for. And some of it's a bit unloved. So yeah, that's always good fun. Time Aware Museums. Oh, great stuff. Community formal engagement. Nice to meet you, Alina and Kate. And hi, Kate. I chatted to you earlier. Yeah. I ran an event at the Great North Museum, Hancock, back in 2018. So I was on the board of directors for the European Marine Science Educators. So we ran our annual conference there. It was a great venue, really, yeah, awesome place to do it. And we've got a dinosaur workshop to Key Stage 1 and 2. Okay, cool. Well, I've got to say, like, there's going to be a little bit of dinosaurs in my talk, but I'm going to focus on what I think is slightly cooler than dinosaurs. So we'll see if people agree at the end of this. So what I'm going to do, I'll introduce myself a bit more formally. Let me just share my screen. There we go. Share screen. Come on, share screen. Why aren't you working? Share screen. There you are. Find my screen. Here we go. So here is a piece of AI art that I got Bing Image Creator to make for the session. If you've not played around with it, I strongly recommend it. I basically just typed in a whale with legs standing triumphantly over a dead dinosaur, and which I thought set the session off nicely, called How Whales Lost Their Legs. And so within this, we're going to weave in elements of evolution. We're going to bring in elements of adaptation and also interdependence. And what is quite nice about these topics is that they feature in both the primary and the secondary curriculum within science, especially interdependence as we get further along. This idea that, you know, if we affect something somewhere, it's going to have knock-on effects elsewhere. Adaptation is obviously quite a large part of the biology curriculum at Key Stage 2. So that's quite useful. And like you say, evolution doesn't tend to come in because it's quite an abstract concept. So this doesn't tend to really rear its head until into secondary. But some kids will be aware of it in years 5 and 6 probably. And roughly with the idea that we used to be monkeys. That's generally what they get. But actually the mechanisms of how it works generally isn't introduced until the secondary level because they don't have the cognitive ability to kind of deal with this quite abstract concept of evolution. So me, who am I? I am a marine researcher. I was a scientist. I was a science teacher, and I left and I ended up doing a PhD in marine science at the University of Bath. So I was lucky enough to go to the Southern Ocean on board the James Clark Ross with the British Antarctic Survey. My PhD focused on the shape of plankton and how this helped them become dominant or fade out in different marine environments, and how that might change with climate change. So I had this lab over in Sweden, which I would use. And so these black things here are basically tanks. Scientists like to call them mesocosms to make them sound more impressive. But this is just the top half of them. They were 5 meters high, and each one held 2 tons of water. And I'd fill them up with a population of plankton, and I would change the conditions inside it, and I would see how the plankton responded to it. So it's kind of cool. So we kind of set up a lab for how climate change is going to change, how the ocean is going to change with climate change as we work forward. So yeah, so these are the things that I study, phytoplankton, and they are amazingly important. So I do a whole talk when I go into schools, and the talk is just about plankton. And everyone's like, what, really? You're going to talk about plankton? And basically these are unicellular plants. They are single cell plants that are the same width as a human hair. So for scale, there is a human hair under a microscope, and these tiny little plants, because the oceans cover like 2/3 to 3/4, depending on how you measure it, of our planet, and the oceans are full of these things, they produce up to 80% of the oxygen that keeps us alive, not just near the coast, but anywhere. You could be like in Central Africa, and the air that you are breathing in, the oxygen, 80% of it came from the ocean. So these things are real ecosystem engineers, and we'll look at that as we go along a little bit further. But yeah, so what I normally do is I stand in front of an assembly and I say, everyone, I'd like you to take a great big breath. And everyone goes, oh, and I say, now breathe it out. Ah. And you're like, okay. And I say, that breath came from the trees. And that's what we're taught at school, that trees and grass and land make all the air, all the oxygen that keeps us alive through photosynthesis. But then I say, can you take a second breath and breathe that one out? Oh. And I'm like, that breath didn't come from the trees. That breath came from the seas. And then they're like, whoa, no way. And if you really want to hammer the fact home, I say that basically these things are farting out oxygen continuously. So right now, the thing that's keeping us alive are plankton farts. And you imagine they quite enjoy that. So that's what I study, phytoplankton, love them. So while I was a teacher, I became quite interested in education outside of the formal classroom. And I got involved with this event called Whale Fest. This happened down in Brighton 9 years ago now. And at the time, and I believe it still is, it was the world's largest ocean festival. So we had 15,000 people a day attend it, and a team of 900 volunteers. And I'm hidden in there somewhere. I think I'm wearing a lab coat towards the middle there, underneath the E. You can just see me, the E of Whale Fest. So I kind of got interested in kind of drawing upon my ocean background. I was a physical oceanographer before I became a teacher. So I found that I was drawing upon ocean examples more and more to help contextualize a lot of the national curriculum. So I went and I ran basically a hands-on kids area at Whale Fest with loads of science experiments. We did an oil spill cleanup and microscopy and fish dissections and things like that. And these are all things which I've taken forward when we go into schools with Incredible Oceans. And basically, I decided, you know what, I'm going to give it a go. And I set up this organization called Incredible Oceans. So I did have, up until last year, a life-size inflatable orca. And I would go around various places, music festivals, schools, and I would do talks and storytelling and workshops all themed around the ocean for lots of different levels. Frustratingly, I hired the orca to Steve Backshall from Deadly 60 fame, and his crew, when he took it on tour, were not particularly gentle with the orca, and it ended up being very broken by the time we got back to it. So Steve bought it off us. So this is something I no longer have access to, which is slightly annoying, but I do have a large inflatable ocean dome, which kind of makes up for it. So we've got this nice inflatable deck venue, which you pop around. And so, yeah, so basically what I discovered is, I guess previously I'd looked at whales and dolphins as a slightly cheesy thing. Like if someone said to me, oh, my favorite animal is the dolphin, I'd be like, yeah, oh, really, is it? You know, and I found initially them to be quite useful, I guess, kind of mascots for talking about ocean conservation, and, you know, the charismatic megafauna, great ways for talking to people about different ocean science ideas and things. And then so gradually over the last 8 or 9 years, I've just accumulated so much whale and dolphin knowledge that it's kind of culminated now in the fact that I'm now running new scientist whale watching trips to the Azores and to Antarctica. So if you do fancy coming on holiday with me, then you can. But there we go. So yeah, anyway, so I thought we'd start off then. Oh, I'd just like to say, I'd quite like this for this to be slightly interactive. So I'm going to pause at a couple of different points. And if people have got questions, please ask a question. And if there is any points that I'm saying something, so there'll be these stops, I guess, within this, so people can kind of talk about maybe a bit more thoughtful or discuss a concept. If there's just a clarification question partway through, like, hold on, what was that you said? Or could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Then please pop that in the chat, and I don't mind responding to that as we go along. But so this is one of those areas. This is one of the points that we're stopping just to check and see if there's any questions that anyone might have before I soldier on. And I can't see anyone typing, so I'm going to continue. So part of a lot of what we have to do as science teachers and things, and it was in the national curriculum, is classification. And so one of the great things to look at is, first of all, what is a whale? So we're gonna start basic, and we're gonna slowly build up to the more hardcore stuff. So whales and dolphins and porpoises are all part of a family called cetaceans. And this word cetacean comes from the Greek word ketos, or the Latinized version of it, cetus, which is this monster that you can see on the left there on this piece of Greek pottery. So essentially the Greek myth is that Zeus and Cassiopeia, they had some kids, and Cassiopeia said, Andromeda is so beautiful. She's the most beautiful goddess ever. And Poseidon, king of the sea, was like, actually, I think you'll find that my daughters are actually really pretty. So what they ended up doing was Andromeda was tied to a rock, and Poseidon sent Ketos, this big sea monster, to go and eat her. Perseus, who quite fancied Andromeda, was like, no, and he ended up killing Cetus. So that's where this name comes from. It's basically the ancient Greek for sea monster. So that has morphed into this group, cetaceans. So that's whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And so when we look at classifying these, all the kids, especially, you know, quite early on, are really excited to tell you that they are not fish and that they are, in fact, mammals. And that's normally a thing that they've picked up. And then we have to look a little bit more detail in terms of classification. This tends to come in Key Stage 3 and Year 7 and things like that, where you talk a little bit about classification and actually what makes a mammal a mammal. Yes, whales are mammals, but why are they mammals? Like, what have they got that makes them mammals? So the main reason that they're mammals and not fish is that they have lungs. They breathe air. So much in the same way as we have to hold our breath when we go underwater, whales, dolphins, porpoises have to do exactly the same. They breathe air. They don't have gills. Gills are the equipment that things have to absorb dissolved oxygen from fluid, whereas lungs absorb oxygen from the air, which you know, an air is a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide and various other gases like argon and stuff like that. So they breathe air. That's the main thing. They hold their breath when they go underwater. And some of these whales and dolphins, I believe there's one called it's called Cuvier's beaked whale, and it holds the world record where it can hold its breath for 2.5 hours, which is pretty impressive. I always say to the kids, imagine watching Frozen while holding your breath, because sometimes that's the only way to get through that movie. Anyway, holding your breath, there we go. So the other thing that they do, all mammals have mammary glands, so they suckle their young. So there is such a thing as whale milk. And whale milk, unlike cow milk or human milk, is ridiculously high in fat. So the reason we drink cow milk is that in terms of fat content, it's very similar to human milk. So it's about 5% fat. Whale milk is about 80% fat. And so when a young whale calf is suckling, they need that extra energy to not only grow, but they also need to quite quickly build a layer of blubber to keep them warm and to stop losing energy and stop using their heat out into the colder ocean. So a young calf, while suckling, will be putting on about 1 kilogram of weight an hour. So that's pretty hardcore. It's a little bit like me eating during lockdown. Yeah, there we go. But as a result, so whales, basically, their mammary glands are within these slits along their abdomen, and they're kind of highly pressurized. They're under pressure. So when the whale wants to feed the calf, they kind of poke their boobs, their mammary gland, out of this slit and squirt under high pressure the milk into the calf's mouth. And because it's so thick in terms of fat content, the consistency is more like toothpaste. So it's more like a gummy paste. So yeah, it's not anything you would want to put on your cereal or in your cups of tea. There we go. So the other thing that they've got is they have hair. And this is a really weird idea that, okay, so all mammals have hair, or they used to have hair. Things like naked mole rats have got rid of theirs. So not only do most whales, do they have hair in the womb, and they get a lot, and depending on what species, they get rid of that hair when they're born. They kind of shed it as they come out. But things like, so this is the head of a humpback whale. And these are things called tubercles. So these are basically like giant ingrown hair follicles. And they'll be all over the whale's head, and they'll be on the edge of its tail and the edge of the flippers. And these tubercles actually help it become more aerodynamic. So fluid dynamicists have modeled how whale fins and whale tails cut through the water. And these tubercles actually help it become more energy efficient. So by kind of repurposing its hair as in this format, it's helped the whales basically be more fuel efficient. They're more energy efficient as they're cutting through the water. And some species, such as these ones, you can actually see they've still got bristles on their faces. And here you can see these big patches of calcium carbonate deposits, which are from barnacles. So the barnacles end up attaching to their faces, and whales will have loads of like lice and barnacles and various other skin parasites that live among this. So they're like giant floating cities, really covered in parasites. It's pretty gross. But yeah, there we go. So yes, they have hair. And then the other thing, so we've got lots of different things that live in the sea. Whales are vertebrates. They have backbones. They have skeletons. And what's quite interesting is that they have legs. And everyone's like, okay, so like you can see there, their flippers have a similar structure to like our hands. They've got, you know, those kind of 5 prongs, and they've got a lot of the similar bones in our hand as they have in their fins. But crucially, what they've got on the back there, these are what are known as vestigial leg bones. And these are the things that are left over from when whales used to be 4-legged. And so we're going to talk a little bit about whale evolution as we go on. But yeah, these vestigial leg bones are ridiculous if you think about it. And kids love that fact, to say, did you know that whales have legs? And I'd love to find one on a beach and be like, oh, look, it's a whale leg. It's kind of a cool thing. But it's really interesting when you see whale and dolphin skeletons in museums. Do have a look at where the pelvis would have been. And pretty much every single whale, dolphin, porpoise species has got these little bones at the back left over from when they had legs. There we go. So previously we would have classed whales and dolphins as some kind of weird separate thing, but we now know that they're part of they're classed as even-toed ungulates, even though they don't have toes, which is quite interesting. So their closest related relatives that we now know, looking at genetics and things like that, are actually giraffes, pigs, and hippos. So again, this blows kids' minds. This giant thing swimming in the ocean, which you would assume would be more closely related to a shark or something like that, its actual living closest relatives are things like hippos. And you can kind of see, and we'll look a little bit about how the lifestyle that a hippo has is quite similar to how early whales ended up hanging out. So quick point before I soldier on. Any questions at this point? Please pop them in the chat before I move on further. Okay, I'm going to continue. Look at this. You guys, you're just like, yeah, I got this, Russ. I need to ask a question. Okay, so I'm going to close down the chat window. Right, let's do this. So we're now going to go on and we're going to look at, where did whales come from? Like, how did they get in the ocean? What's going on there? And so for this, we're going to look back a little bit about what we were been looking at previously with Andrew's talk in terms of geological time. And we don't often see Earth's time presented like this. So at one end, we've got present day. At the other end, we've got the formation of the planet. So it's about 4.6 billion years old, Earth. And there's this idea, okay, like if I asked most people, when did dinosaurs appear? They'd probably say, you know, stick it somewhere halfway, maybe a bit closer towards the beginning of the Earth. But actually, if we look at what's been going on during Earth's time, during that chunk of it, there was nothing alive on Earth. It was mainly just water and volcanoes and just not very nice. Then for that chunk of Earth, we had stuff living, but it was all like primordial soup, and it was like single-celled organisms that hung around in the ocean. And these were amazing ecosystem engineers. And then multicellular life happened, and animals and things, which is, you know, all the bits that we're interested in. That is that tiny bit there. So, and you know, when you look at how long humans have been here, humans would be thinner than the edge of the white line on there. So we've hardly been here at all in terms of Earth's geological history. So we're going to zoom into this chunk, the bit where multicellular life has arisen. And so as we talked before, we had these awesome creatures that hung around in Earth's ocean. We had ammonites, and which basically the precursor to modern day squids and octopuses. What's fantastic is their shells that they lived in and had buoyancy things in, much like a modern day nautilus. They had air kind of pockets inside it, and they could put air in and out of it, or gases, and that would help them position themselves within the water column. And we had these trilobites. Trilobites hold the record for being the most successful creature that has ever lived on the planet. So we're used to thinking that, oh, okay, dinosaurs did a pretty good job, but trilobites were basically here for about 300 million years. To kind of put that into perspective, humans, as we know it, have been here for about 30,000. So 300 million years is how long trilobites were on the Earth, and they're pretty cool. I like the fact that their eyes are made of crystals of pure quartz. So they literally grow their eyes out of their carapace, out of pure quartz. And they came in loads and loads of different shapes and sizes and scurried about on the seafloor and ate dead things and stuff. Very similar to kind of modern day woodlouse, which incidentally, woodlice are not insects. They are crustaceans. And I've been told if you eat them, they taste fishy, because woodlice used to live in the sea. They kind of came out of it. So they're like a long lost cousin of, if you like, of the trilobite. So we had this period called the Carboniferous, which we looked at, and the Carboniferous period is really, really fascinating, because there's this idea that we think, oh, it's like, okay, we've always had life on land, but for millions of years there was only life in the sea. And the reason for that was because the sun is constantly bombarding the planet with radiation, ultraviolet light and gamma rays and microwave radiation, all this high-end, really high-frequency radiation. And so we needed a decent enough atmosphere to absorb that. So as we got this multicellular life that started photosynthesizing and taking that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and giving off oxygen, that oxygen was able to form into ozone, which is O3 in the upper atmosphere. And it was only then, once our atmosphere had gone through that change and the ozone layer had been established, that basically living out of water was no longer dangerous. You were no longer just going to be completely bombarded with all of this toxic, really high frequency radiation. So we got the ozone layer, and that meant all of a sudden then things could start colonizing land. And so thinking back again, we're quite rare as a planet Earth, because we have a giant moon. For the size of us, our moon is quite big compared to other planets. And the moon is, we know this because astronauts put a mirror on the moon and NASA fire a laser at it. And so they're measuring how far the moon is moving away from us with time. So at the moment, the Earth moon system is a little bit like that thing where kids hold cross hands and they swing round in a playground and they let go of each other and they fly off. So the center of gravity, the moon doesn't necessarily orbit us, but rather we both spin round each other. And so the moon is moving further away from us at the same rate as our fingernails grow. So we can reverse that and be like, well, hold on a sec. This means that millions of years ago, the moon would have taken up most of the night sky. It would have been absolutely massive. And as a result, the tides would have been really, really big. And so tides played a really, really important role in helping animals get out of the sea. So gradually over time, they could get used to kind of periods of being outside of the sea before the tide came back in and covered them again. And so it was a combination of the ozone layer and these tides that helped creatures slowly make their way out onto land. And for millions of years, we just had these trees. So these are called scale trees, or lepidodendrons. And these are giant pieces of broccoli, 90 meters high. And what was amazing about them is that at this point, like funguses and detritivores, things that break down and rot down wood, hadn't evolved yet. So whenever it was windy, these trees would just snap. They were quite brittle and would pile up in thick layers on the Earth's surface. And that is what ended up becoming our coal deposits. And in fact, these carboniferous forests, that is why they're called carboniferous, because they were so high in carbon. And they were kind of a victim of their own success, because they took so much carbon out of the atmosphere and turned it into oxygen that they ended up kind of making themselves less productive. So we've got this carboniferous, and the interesting thing, again, this was that Andrew's talked about, is there's been lots and lots of different every single geological era is punctuated and ended with a massive extinction event and new species appear. So the end of the Carboniferous happened, and then we go through these different ones. And the extinction event that most people know about is what we call the KT boundary, or the end of the Cretaceous period. And this was when the dinosaurs died out. Now, what's been really interesting is that if you ask most people what killed the dinosaurs, they say, it was from a giant asteroid that crashed into Earth in modern day Mexico. And this caused basically loads of dust to go up into the atmosphere, and sunlight couldn't get through. And we ended up, like 99% of the life ended up dying. And so this is the kind of images that happen. But what has been really interesting is literally in the last kind of 2 years, loads and loads and loads of evidence has shown that probably the thing that killed the dinosaurs was not the asteroid, but was in fact giant volcanoes in India. So there's this region called the Deccan Traps. And this was a period of volcanism that lasted a ridiculous amount of time. I mean, you can see how many cubic kilometers of lava, like 1.5 million cubic kilometers of lava, were expunged out of the Earth into this. And so basically what happened, we had loads and loads of volcanoes spewing all of this ash into the atmosphere, lowered the temperatures. Then we got the asteroid in the middle of it, which made matters even worse. And then the volcanoes continued for a little bit longer. So it's really interesting if you start looking up and looking at the new evidence that's come to light, where people have started modeling this and looking at geologically what's been going on. So yeah, it's quite interesting that, yeah, basically it looks like now the evidence is showing, literally in the last 2 years, that it would have been these supervolcanoes that killed the dinosaurs. So essentially what happened, we had this mass extinction event, and then all of a sudden 99% of life on Earth died off, and then some life remained. And the life that was able to remain all of a sudden had these ecological niches that they could explore and exploit. They were no longer being occupied by animals, by existing animals. So this is the great thing. And then we get this explosion of life. And so what happened at about 50 million years ago is we had this thing called Indohyus. And this was quite small. It was like, and it was kind of like part rat, part deer. And this was the last common ancestors of hippos and whales. So this thing would have hung around around estuaries and probably would have been a bit of a scavenge hunter. It might have ate fish and things like that. So we've got this Indohyus. And then what happened slowly is Indohyus morphed into this thing called Pakicetus. And Pakicetus is really interesting because when we look at the bones and the density of the bones in its legs and the position of its eyes, the bone density is similar to that of modern day hippos. So what they think is that Pakicetus here would have hung out like standing in water with its eyes just above the waterline, and it would have ambushed things and jumped out the water and grabbed things. And they think it would have been similar to a modern day hyena. So this is the size of them, and you can see there's a modern hyena for reference there. And you can see that the artist drawing Pakicetus has definitely drawn upon that same kind of coloring for it. So this was unbelievably, this creature is the ancestor of all whales and dolphins that are in the sea. And this is why I love this. And kids are like, what? When you tell them like whales used to be like a dog, rat, deer thing, like what is going on, right? So basically Pakicetus hanging around in water more and more and more, and here's a Pakicetus skull. You can see those are pretty gnarly teeth. You wouldn't want to mess with the Pakicetus. There we go. And then gradually what happened is they became slowly and slowly more and more aquatic. And so this thing called Ambulocetus looks really, really strange. And what I really love is this idea. It's called convergent evolution. And it's a really lovely thought experiment where essentially how it goes is like, if you remove all of the life and then you just stick an animal in a certain habitat, it will end up looking the same each time because it needs to be adapted for that environment and to live in that environment. So basically, if we got rid of all of the crocodiles and just stuck mammals there, eventually they would end up looking like this. This is the mammal version of a crocodile. So this would have lived and eaten and like basically been a hairy crocodile. This would have hung out in the shallows. It would have been an ambush predator, and it would have been quite slow and deliberate and probably wouldn't have been that great on land, much like an alligator or crocodile. So yeah, this idea of convergent evolution is really interesting. And you might have heard that like crabs have evolved multiple times, and moles and things like that. So these creatures, we get similar forms in animals if they end up living in the same environment. So yeah, the mammal equivalent of a crocodile. So as time went on and these animals became more and more and more adapted to an aquatic environment. So we end up with this thing, which isn't that cute. I've got to say, I'd be absolutely terrified if a Rhodocetus came towards me and was like, hi. It looks pretty terrifying, but you can see here we're in these kind of transitional forms, and you can see, okay, I can kind of imagine this as a point getting more towards modern whales potentially. So 46 million years ago, Rhodocetus, we can see there, it's kind of lost its hair. It's become more streamlined. It's got this webbing. And then gradually, as time went on, we ended up with these things, which are kind of a little bit more otter-like. So yeah, Kutchicetus and Remingtonocetus, named after the naturalist that discovered it. And so we had these things living around, these kind of long, slim otters. And you can see here, crucially, is that they started propelling themselves, that's the word, using their tails. And so they would push themselves along using their tails more and more and more, which meant that their back legs didn't have to do as much work. So their back legs could start shrinking. And so we ended up, gradually going through these other strange forms, these transitional forms. And this was happening globally. It wasn't just a straight line. We had lots of different species all kind of going through these changes in different areas. And so, yeah, again, these are, slightly taller than a modern human. And then we ended up with this. And this, the Basilosaurus, was the apex predator of its time. This was the largest carnivore on Earth. And when it was first discovered, as the name would suggest, we thought it was a dinosaur, a Basilosaurus. That hence it's called an Osaurus, even though it isn't a lizard. And the reason that we know it wasn't a lizard is they were looking at a fossilized skeleton of it, and inside its skeleton were some ear bones. And they pulled out these ear bones from the fossil, and one scientist was handing it to another scientist and dropped it on the floor, and it ended up smashing open, and the inside of it looked exactly the same as a modern day whale's inner ear bone, which we knew because this was all going on during the height of whaling. So the scientist was like, hold on a sec, I think this might not be a dinosaur. I think this might be a whale. And so, yeah, we ended up reclassifying Basilosaurus as not a dinosaur, but as a whale. And they were pretty formidable. I mean, how big they are for their size and that set of teeth are pretty hardcore. So normally when I talk to going to schools, there's always this like nerdy kid who's like, they're either super into dinosaurs or some of them have watched some documentaries about the Meg. And so for people that don't know, this is the largest, one of the largest shark that ever existed. And it died out relatively recently. So about 3.5 million years ago, this was swimming around our oceans. And around the UK, you can find their teeth in sand beds. I think someone found one of their teeth in Norfolk, on the beach in Norfolk last year. So these things were apex predators of their time, and these were swimming around the ocean eating loads and loads of stuff, and we're going to come back to these. And so normally kids are like, megalodons are so cool, massive shark, they're going to eat everything, they're so cool. And then you can just be like, well, actually, mate, did you know that there was a type of whale that ate megalodons? And so this is a megalodon jaw, to give you an idea of its size, exactly the same as a great white shark, but 7 times the size. And there was a creature, a whale, called Livyatan melvilli, which means Melville's monster, named after Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick. And this thing holds the world record for having the largest teeth that have ever existed on Earth, like bigger than any of the dinosaurs. Its teeth are 2 feet long, like literally teeth like this big. And this thing, as well as having the intelligence of a modern day sperm whale, and would have been a pack hunter and would have lived in quite large social groups, these things would have been large enough and clever enough and fast enough to eat megalodons. So that's pretty cool. Imagine living in seas 5 million years ago. It wasn't that long ago in terms of geological history. And it's quite lucky that we're alive now, really, because I don't think the ocean would be a particularly fun place to swim with all of these beasts swimming around in it. So yeah, I feel quite lucky to be alive at this time. There we go. So for me, you see quite often when we talk about evolution, people are quite familiar with that like ascent of man going from the monkeys up into, modern day humans. And people might talk about Darwin's finches and things. But for me, I think whales provide a much, much more interesting story. And you can see how the whales have evolved. So this is basically going, he's an amazing Jordan Culver. He's an amazing artist based in Bristol, and he put this together. So each frame within this, I don't know, is 1 million years or something like that. So you can see how something like Pakicetus would have slowly morphed into something like Livyatan melvilli. And yeah, I just think it's such an amazing story of evolution. It's really, really cool, really, really interesting. And what is really nice as well is you can bring it back round to Darwin, because Darwin noted this in his book on the origin of species. So he said in North America, sorry, I've got various zoom bits over the screen, I'm just going to move these out of the way. In North America, the black bear was seen swimming for extended periods with a widely open mouth, thus catching, like a whale, insects in the water. So that's kind of cool that bears just go ah and swim along like that and allow insects to go in their mouths. And he basically postulated, he said, even in so extreme a case as this, if the supply of insects were constant, and if better adapted competitors did not already exist in the country, I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. So I think that is pretty awesome that even Darwin was like, hold on a sec, there's definitely something here that we can feed back to. I think that's pretty awesome. So, next little point for pausing. Anyone got any comments? Any questions? Pop them in. It would be great to recreating plasticine. Blob, blob, blob. Morphing them around. Good call, good call. Any other questions? Feel free to type them in. As we always say to the students, there's no such thing as a silly question. Unless it's a really silly question. No. Okay, well, I'm learning some great facts to attempt to impress my own kids at the dinner table. It's true. Just say, you know, whales used to be dogs. It's quite true. So thanks for that, Melanie. Awesome. Right. So, soldiering on then. I thought it'd be good, and it seems like a weird question to ask, like, why did whales get so big? But it's like, it's a good question, and it's quite often like the simplest questions that are the toughest ones to answer. You know, like, why is the sky blue? It's actually just not like an easy question. You actually have to have quite an in-depth knowledge of like how light functions and refraction and all the rest of it. So how did whales get so big? Well, let's find out. So there we have got two different types of whales. So we've got what are called the Odontocetes, or the toothed whales, and they're the largest group. And so dolphins and porpoises will be included in this group here. They're also classed as toothed whales. And there's about 73 species of those. But we have got only 16 species of the other type, which is Mystocetes. And so these are the baleen whales. And so we're gonna focus on these guys because these are the ones that tend to be slightly bigger. The sperm whale, which you can see there as my representative of the toothed whale, is the largest carnivore on Earth, and that's pretty cool. But I think in terms of answering our question, the baleen whales offer a more interesting kind of route into this. So the baleen whales, and for any people that have seen Finding Nemo, when they go inside the whale's mouth and they can see Nemo and Dory get tangled up in that whale hair in the mouth, they literally have retained their hair from when they were mammals, but instead of it just like disappearing from outside of them, they're like, let's grow it in sheets in the roof of my mouth. So these things literally have a moustache inside their mouths. And it's this that they use to feed. And it's quite interesting in terms of how they feed. So these are the baleen plates. And this is one of the things when we used to hunt whales, we used to harvest from them. So this was basically the Victorian equivalent of plastic. It was very flexible and you could mold it into different shapes. So people that have heard of whalebone corsets, it wasn't actually the whale bone, but it was strips of this flexible baleen that would have been put inside the corsets to give them, to help them keep their shape. And this would have been used as well in like lampshades and in those Victorian dresses that were very kind of poofy at the side. They would have had rings of baleen of inside them. And this stuff, yeah, is made of keratin, the same stuff that our hair and fingernails is made from. So yeah, so this stuff is pretty flexible. Obviously now we have plastic, so we don't have to hunt whales anymore. Obviously plastic comes with a lot of its own problems, whereas this is biodegradable. But I'm not at all suggesting we should go and hunt whales to make ice cream tubs and things like that. Now we should just stop being a slightly less having a disposable way of being. But anyway, so I thought I'd show this and we'll focus on this. This is the blue whale, and the blue whale's pretty big. In fact, well, whenever I talk about the blue whale, again, what a time to be alive. This is the largest animal that has ever existed on Earth, ever. Not like now, it happens to be the biggest one in our ocean now. This is bigger than any of the dinosaurs. It is absolutely phenomenally massive. And yeah, there's always some dinosaur nerd doing, the Wakachokosaurus is bigger than this. And it's like, nah, mate, this is ridiculously big. It's 33 meters long. And I could give you loads of other numbers about how big it is and how much it weighs, but they're quite difficult for human brains to understand. 3 buses long, that might help in terms of how big it is, but I prefer to use other ways to kind of show off how big it is and to get an idea of like, oh, whoa, okay, this is a pretty big creature. So first of all, I always get kids to do this with their hand, make a fist, and I get them to put it in the middle of their chest and then a little bit to the left. And that's how big your heart is and where your heart is. So the older you are, your hands grow with you. So older people with bigger hands have larger hearts, but that's about how big your heart is, right? A blue whale's heart is as big as a car, and you can swim down its veins and arteries like they were water slides. That is how big a blue whale is. Like, that is mental. Compare your fist to a car. That is just the difference in terms of I'm just like, what? I still can't believe that. It's a ridiculous fact. So, and what I really love is, despite them being so big, they feed on zooplankton, or specifically a type of zooplankton called krill. And krill is very abundant, especially around the Southern Ocean, around Antarctica. And I'll explain why that is in a little bit. But these are basically tiny shrimp. They about the same size, and they fit on the bottom of your finger. And my favorite krill fact, and people always challenge me on this, but I'm afraid it's true, right? If you had a set of scales and you put all of the krill, so that's a ball of krill there. You put all the krill on Earth on one set of the scales, and you put all of the humans, all 8 billion humans, on the other side of the scales, right? So bear in mind, this is how big one krill is, right? If you had that, all the krill on Earth versus all the humans on Earth, all the krill on Earth weighs 100 times more than all of the humans on Earth. Now that, I was just like, what the hell? Like, there is a lot of krill in our ocean. And so this is really important because it means that these giant animals have got a food source. So we can see here, we can see how big they are compared to a human here, but crucially, how they feed is a really amazing adaptation. And so we're used to thinking like, okay, like the basic version is that whales are filter feeders, and they use that hair to filter the krill out of the water. And that's kind of like a massively oversimplified version, because what they actually do is they are lunge feeders. And so what they can do, the bottom of their throat is pleated so it can stretch loads. And when they find one of these big balls, what's called a bait ball of krill, they come up underneath it and they swallow it and all the water, and they put it in their mouth in one go. And bearing in mind that they already weigh 100 tons, when a blue whale opens its mouth and swallows water, it doubles in size and weight. So it will swallow 100 tons of water and krill, and that's what it will have in its mouth. But what it doesn't want to do, it doesn't want to swallow and ingest that seawater, the same way as when we don't particularly enjoy swallowing seawater ourselves. They don't want to ingest the seawater, they just want to ingest the krill. So this is the next size comparison that comes in. So basically, they ingest 500,000 calories in krill in one gulp. But crucially, they do not want to eat the seawater. So they've got a couple of mechanisms that help them do this. And so this was a scientific paper that came out about 10 years ago, where they discovered this organ on a whale's chin in between its two jaw bones. And it's like a balloon. It's like a spongy balloon. It was overlooked for years. And basically, this is a special organ that helps the whale decide the key moment to open its mouth. Because if, as a whale is swimming up and quickly opens its mouth, it's like opening a parachute underwater really rapidly. And so if the whale opens its mouth at the wrong point, it will produce a pressure wave that will push all of the krill away from its face, and it'll end up with not eating any of them. It will just get a mouthful of seawater. Other version of that is if it opens its mouth too soon, then it can break its jaw, or it would entirely just get a mouthful of seawater. So this weird organ at the point where its jaws meet help it figure out the optimum kind of pressure, speed at it to open its mouth, and how much to open their mouth by, so they maximize the amount of krill that they swallow. So in terms of scale, its jaw bones, each one of those jaw bones is the largest bone that there has ever been on Earth. They are so ridiculously big, their jaw bones. And so they're about the size of an oak tree. And so this, kind of trying to imagine this in terms of scales and sizes and things, this is the equivalent of, like, this organ is about the size and consistency of a water balloon, and it's between 2 oak trees. So that is how this organ evolves. And you can see here, I've just put some pictures in here of the pleats on the bottom of the whale that help its kind of mouth expand over. So it's done this, it's opened its mouth properly, it's got a giant mouthful of water and krill, and what it wants is just the krill. So what it does, this is a whale's tongue, and I always get the kids, I'm like, stick your tongues out. Bleh. And then I'm like, okay, imagine now that your tongue weighs as much as an elephant, so 2 tons, and is so big that it can fit 2 football teams on it. And they're like, what? Like, imagine your tongue like that big. That's how big a blue whale's tongue is. And it's this tongue that they use to feed. So they've got their mouth full of water and krill. So what they do is they press this tongue up against the roof of their mouth. And then the water is forced out in between the baleen, the hairs, but the krill is trapped. So the analogy that I always get the kids to do is, I'm like, okay, so imagine tomorrow morning when you're having your breakfast cereal, take a great big spoonful of cereal, use your tongue to spray all the milk out between your teeth and just swallow the cereal down. And if your parents tell you off for making a mess, just say, I'm applying my learning. You should be proud of me. So they quite like that. Well, I tell them to do it. Like, if you're on a date with a marine biologist, always order the soup and eat like that at the restaurant. They'll be super impressed. So what's really interesting, though, I really love about this, is that even though they've got this massive mouth, their throat is actually quite small. And so all these stories about, like, people being swallowed by whales, it's actually impossible, because if you threw a football into the whale's mouth, it wouldn't be able to swallow it. It would have to spit it out again. So yes, it would be actually impossible for a human to be swallowed by a filter feeding whale like a blue whale. There we go. So I thought at this point, so we've talked about these things are really big. And what I'd like to do now is draw upon this idea of interdependence. And we're going to relate this back to this thing called continental drift. And how come we've got so much krill in the ocean? So continental drift was kind of put forward in the 1940s by Alfred Wegener. And it's this idea that, you know, inside our planet, we've got all this magma, and it's got currents inside it. And the crust on the outside that we live on floats across this liquid layer. So over millions of years, these continents move around again at about the same rate that our fingernails grow. And crucially, what happened to set up the ocean that we've got today is that Antarctica separated from South America and Australia. And in doing that, this geological process changed how productive our oceans are. So you can see here, so we're moving away from Pangaea, which is when all the continents were stuck together. Here we go. And then it separates from New Zealand, separates from South America, and we've got modern day. So that is crucial in getting the ocean into the situation that it is today. So around 34 million years ago, Antarctica separated. And in doing so, it became a continent all by itself. And that has allowed, and the fact that it's exactly over the South Pole as well means that some really interesting planetary physics have been set up. And what we've got, you can see it here, we've got this amazing current that can flow all the way around an entire continent that also happens to be exactly on the South Pole, which is the point that our planet orbits through. So we have such a situation that's been set up so specifically it's the only time it's happened in Earth's history. If you think about all the other continents, they kind of like hem the sea in. They act as a barrier. But here, the Southern Ocean, the water can flow freely all the way around a continent. And what this has done is this circular current has set up globally this oceanic circulation, this giant conveyor belt called the thermohaline circulation. Thermo, because it's got something to do with temperature, and haline, because it's got stuff to do with the saltiness of the water. And both of these, the saltiness of the water and the temperature of water, change the density of the water. And so what we end up with is this giant conveyor belt that takes about 1,000 years to do a lap all the way around. And this is ocean circulation going all the way around. And at the heart of it is that Southern Ocean current. You can see it here. That spinning current is the motor. It's the powerhouse that is causing this ocean circulation. I also really like this picture because normally on a map, we rip the sea apart so we can see the land clearly. What we've got here, this is called the Spillhouse projection, where we've ripped the land apart to see the ocean properly. And what I really love about this is that we can see all of the world's oceans are connected. They're all joined together. So I deliberately, when I talk about it, I don't talk about separate oceans. I only ever talk about ocean. And I talk about the Atlantic Ocean Basin, the Pacific Ocean Basin. But the idea by talking about only one ocean, it really highlights the fact that this interconnectedness and this interdependence idea. And if you stick a load of pollution in one area, it's going to eventually reach another area. It also psychologically means that if you talk to people about just one thing, we've only got one ocean, our ocean, psychologically, it means that they're more likely to protect it. So because they think we've only got one of something, which is true. We have only got one ocean, so we should look after it much better. So yes, the bit of this thermohaline circulation that most people know is, I'm going to see if my cursor can work there. This bit here, this red line that scrolls across here, that is the Gulf Stream. And that takes warm water from the Caribbean, from the tropics, and brings it up north to Northern Europe. And as a result, the UK, instead of getting the climate that we should have for our latitude, which is the same as Nova Scotia's or Moscow's, where we would get 8 meters of snow every summer, and we'd have sea ice and things, 8 meters of snow every winter, and we'd have sea ice and things like that. Instead, it melts all the snow and turns it into the rain, and we get the lovely temperate climate that we have at the moment. So yes, thermohaline circulation was allowed to be set up because of geological processes that moved Antarctica away from the other continents over the South Pole and allowed a current to go all the way around it. So that current there, we call the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. And there's various pictures that you can see of this. And this is a vast current. It's the fastest current on Earth. To give you an idea of how hardcore this is, if you added all of, so we measure how fast the current is in something called a Sverdrup, okay? So if we added all of the world's rivers together, it would equal 1 Sverdrup, okay? This current is 300 Sverdrups. This is 300 times bigger than the flow added up of every single river on Earth. It is a massive current. And it's this giant Antarctic circumpolar current going around the South Pole that has set up our oceanic circulation. And crucially, what happens is it pumps nutrient-rich water up from the deep ocean up into the surface. Because phytoplankton are plants, just like any plants, they need nutrients and they need sunlight. So what happens? This Antarctic circumpolar current draws all this deep nutrient-rich water up from the depths into the surface water, where now it means that phytoplankton can use it and they can grow. So this Antarctic circumpolar current driving the thermohaline circulation has made our ocean ridiculously productive. And what we've got here, we've got two different types of marine bacteria and two different types of phytoplankton. And what we can see here is they closely match the ocean currents. And as these different areas are bringing nutrients up from depth, we get these big, rich plankton blooms. And these plankton blooms form the basis of all of the marine food chains. 99.9% of all marine food chains rely on phytoplankton. If we can understand phytoplankton, then we can understand and better manage our fisheries. So we can build this into a really nice food chain, where typically in a food chain, you look at really boring examples like the energy from the sun goes into the grass, which is eaten by a rabbit, which is eaten by a fox. And sometimes you go crazy and you go, energy from the sun goes into grass, which is eaten by an antelope, which is eaten by a lion. And these are the examples. Marine food chains, much more fun, where you can go, energy from the sun goes into microscopic single-cell plants called phytoplankton, which are then eaten by microscopic animals called krill, which are then eaten by the world's largest animal. This is not to scale. But in terms of looking at marine food chains, my experience is that because they're not like terrestrial animals or like just boring things like a rabbit or something, you know, it really brings it home and it makes it a little bit more interesting. So essentially, that Antarctic circumpolar current drawing up the nutrients, increasing the amount of phytoplankton in the ocean, has allowed more krill to grow, which is why we have so much krill, which feeds on the phytoplankton, which has allowed and provided this food source for the whales. And so interestingly, the reason that, or one of the reasons they think that we've only got these really big whales is because it was a defense mechanism against the megalodons. And that megalodon would have eaten all the smaller baleen whales. And we see evidence of these smaller species in the fossil record. And that actually, as our climate changed and all of a sudden we had this bountiful food source available, it meant that the whales could grow really big, really, really quickly. So it became a little bit of an evolutionary arms race. Who can grow the biggest, fastest? Because then you're not going to be eaten by megalodons, which is also a really great way to kind of tie it back around. And kind of looking at how this then affects us is that whales are amazing at fertilizing our ocean as well. So they'll take those nutrients from the South Pole, and as they go on these giant migrations, they poop. And as they poo in the water, their poo is really, really rich in iron, their feces. That's the more scientific word I should be using. Their feces, not their poo, is really high in iron. And it goes out into the ocean and it fertilizes the ocean and it helps more plankton grow. And we've actually got something called the whale pump, that because a lot of these whales, they dive down into the deep ocean where we've got those high nutrients. Instead of having to wait for those nutrients to be upwelled somewhere like the Antarctic circumpolar current, as the whales dive up and down through into the surface ocean, deep ocean, surface ocean, deep ocean, they're mixing water continuously and they're bringing nutrients up from depth every time they do this. So there is something which we can call the whale pump, which is the whales themselves are actually responsible in mixing our ocean, distributing nutrients, helping phytoplankton grow themselves. So this interdependence is really, really important. And the weird thing is then, if we look at the state of what our ocean should be, we can look at how hardcore we hunted whales during the time of, maximum whaling of the Victorian whaling period and up in the 50s. And you can see there in particular, the blue whales, we went from a pre-industrial, pre-whaling state of 340,000 to now currently having 4,000 in the oceans. So can you imagine a world where we have 336,000 more blue whales in our ocean, and how more productive our ocean would have been 200 years ago with all of this much higher level of whales going up and down, up and down, up and down, mixing our ocean and distributing nutrients across it. And in fact, because phytoplankton are plants, all plants photosynthesize, phytoplankton doing a great job at taking the excess carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere that is causing climate change, turning it into their own structure, then sinking and taking that carbon with them into the deep ocean. So actually, if we hadn't have hunted whales so aggressively, our oceans would be much more productive and they would be able to draw down more carbon dioxide than we're currently producing, and we wouldn't be feeling the effects of climate change that we're feeling today. So who'd have thought that whales can literally change our climate, or could have helped us in the battle against climate change? So this is one of the reasons that we want to try and recover their numbers, because by recovering whales' numbers and looking after our ocean, it's going to help us with climate change and get rid of that extra carbon dioxide that we've been sticking up in the air. So some homework. You guys always set homework for people. Here's your homework. First of all, everyone should go whale watching. And if you're like, yeah, Russell, okay, I don't want this shameless plug to come on holiday with you to the Azores. I can't afford to go away somewhere really far. Well, you were lucky, because each one of these yellow dots is somewhere in Europe that you can go and see whales and dolphins. That yellow dot with the square around it, just there you go. I thought that's where Newcastle is. But that yellow dot with the square around it, that is the Azores. And it just happens to be the world whale capital. A third of all whales and dolphins pass through there at one point or another, so it is really cool. Secondly, if you are really into whales and dolphins, can I please politely request that you don't go and see them in captivity? Highly intelligent creatures that live half as long and self-harm and all the rest of it when you put them in captivity. So please go, if you are interested in whales and dolphins, do not go and see them doing tricks and things like that and having to jump through hoops for their food. Instead, go see them in their natural environment, and encourage your students to do so as well. Unfortunately, we still do have dolphinariums in Wales, not in Wales, in Spain and in France and in a lot of Eastern Europe. So please discourage this and encourage people to go whale watching responsibly instead. And finally, if you are interested in this, I have written a book. It is aimed at kind of all ages. I like to think of it as a book that you can kind of keep with you for life. The difficult concepts are explained. It goes through different ocean biomes. I like to say that I don't get any money from the sales of this book. So if you'd like to buy one, go for it. I think it's a good book. We've got 5 different chapters, each one in a different biome. Each chapter goes, look at all the cool stuff that's living here. But then it goes, but this is the bad thing that's happening. But crucially, it then says, but this is what we can do about it. So the book aims to be empowering and celebrates conservation optimism and the steps that we are taking for a better ocean, but also doesn't sugarcoat the problems that our ocean is currently going through. There we go. Thank you ever so much. That's me waffling on long enough. I will see if there's any questions out there. That was quite, it's been quite the information overload, I'd say. There's definitely been a lot to go through. So yeah, and if anyone has got any questions you think of afterwards, or you want to get in contact with me about ocean stuff, my email is there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Russell. That was mind-bending.
Oh well, I've seen all of these new parents' evening. Oh dear, everyone hates parents' evening. Yeah, that is true. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, a whale exists that can eat a meg. Yes. Right. Good luck with parents' evening. You can see dolphins at the coast of Saltburn. There you go. You don't need to go abroad. Exactly right. There's the book. Thanks ever so much, Danny. Appreciate you posting that there. What was that word to measure the current force? Okay, so it's called a Sverdrup, which is named after one of the big physical oceanographers called Harold Sverdrup. It's Sverdrup, and if you basically, because in oceanography we deal with such massive flows, one Sverdrup is the equivalent of 1 million cubic meters of water flowing every second. So you can imagine on those kind of scales, it's far easier just to be like, okay, so basically that Antarctic circumpolar current, that is 300 million cubic meters of water flowing every second, which is pretty impressive. Is it 300? It's 150. Sorry, I got my numbers wrong. It's 150. I'm trying to remember all these numbers. Thank you for your kind words, Patrick. Appreciate that. And yeah, do let me know if there's any other query regarding the extinction. Did these events occur before the meteor impact? If so, does it imply Yes. So basically, this regarding the Deccan traps in India and the volcanic eruption, the new evidence that's come out. If you want to start like looking at the scientific papers, and I hasten to add, this is not just like some quack on YouTube that is putting this forward. This is like this is the great thing about science, is it changes and it challenges our preconceived ideas in light of new evidence. And so this is what, so essentially it looks like life was already dying off quite badly as a result of this giant continuous volcanic eruption, and then basically, while all this volcanism was going on, there was also a meteorite strike. And I believe the people that wrote the scientific paper, they're quoted as saying that certainly wouldn't have helped matters. You're like, already there's the world's largest volcano going off. And I guess slightly worryingly is that we have got evidence that these supervolcanoes can happen again. And right now, if you're familiar with Yellowstone National Park, pretty much half of the continental United States is a supervolcano. And there was quite an interesting BBC like dramatized version of what would happen when the Yellowstone supervolcano goes off. But that's going to be the next one that's going to change it. And when it goes off, basically the whole of North America is going to be blown up or covered in ash. So it's going to be rendered completely and utterly uninhabitable. And so people have looked back on the frequency, and yeah, so as you would imagine, people are looking quite extensively at the Yellowstone to make sure to kind of keep an eye on things. There's my email. Thank you very much. That is a sphere drop. Brilliant. Thanks, Danny. There we go. Any other questions? Well, if you think of one, you've got my email. Ping me an email and I will answer it. There we go. Even if it's not to do with stuff, I'm just gonna say, like Incredible Oceans, we do a lot of teacher training. Particularly, we've been doing a lot of stuff in Wales because the national curriculum has changed. And so we do a lot of, I used to really annoy me when you go to science fairs and things like that, and they're like, look at all this cool this experiment that you can do, but you only need to spend like £2,000 on science equipment. So we come in and we do like a day of teacher training, and basically have all these really cool experiments and practicals and demonstrations that you can do that are themed around the ocean, that you can all do with stuff that you'll already have in a primary school or stuff that you can just buy in Tesco's. For like next to nothing. And it's all been tested and tried out in schools, science festivals and community spaces, and there's accompanying PowerPoints and all the rest of it. And yeah, so I tend to do, I don't know, like 3 or 4 sessions in Wales every year, but that tends to be because the Welsh national curriculum is much more involved. There we go. So I'm in the process of changing our website. So that training website that has just been lovingly put up there is to do. We also do training for academics on how to speak about their research to different audiences in the way that the audiences will understand and care about their research. So we do a lot of work with, and it's good for us because it means that we keep up to date with, you know, new pieces of research and get to interact with scientists as well, so which we enjoy. We like making sure that we stay relevant and up to date. So awesome. Well, I'll let you guys go and sort of decompress and process some of that information. What? There's a whale that eats a megalodon? Yeah, there is. That's a pretty good fact, isn't it? Ha! Screw you, megalodon lovers.
Thanks very much, Russell. I think that's a good note to end on. We'll leave
Sorry,
it with
I didn't mean to say that. I was like, I'm not sure that's sorry. The consummate professional at all times. There you go.
If we could leave you with one message, it's that. Well, thank you very much to Russell and to Andrew and also to Kate for all of our content this afternoon. I hope you've all enjoyed it and had a great afternoon. And thank you to all of you for joining us. As you know, we've recorded this session, so once that is ready and on our YouTube channel, then we will email you to let you know that it's there so that you can come back and refer back to it and use it in your teaching as you wish. My colleague Charlotte will send around a quick feedback survey to you tomorrow, and we'd be really grateful if you could respond to that because it helps us with our next set of programming, which we're just starting to think about now. This session is number 1. Oh, no, it isn't. It's number 4 of 5. So we've got one more of our created sessions, which is next week, and we're shifting subjects and moving on to art next week. So if you or any of your colleagues would like to attend that, then you can book that via our webpage, and I think Danny will pop the link in the chat in a moment if you want to do that. and all our other sessions have been recorded, so we can come back to